Melissa is a transportation research and site plan development manager for Arlington County in Virginia for the Commuter Services Bureau. And she'll be discussing challenges Arlington County has faced in adopting multimodal-oriented impact assessment practices. So now I'm going to switch the baton over to Christina for her to be able to present her presentation.
Great, thank you, John. I will share my screen. All right, well, hello everybody, and thank you for joining us today. I'm going to be presenting on a relatively large study that was recently completed, sponsored by California Department of Transportation. I want to recognize the large team which put this 3-year study together. The PI, principal investigator, was Kelly Clifton out of Portland State University. And we also had participation from Susan Handy and Bob Schneider out of the University of California, Davis, and University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, respectively. We had several different partners and a fairly large participation from the Caltrans staff. So I want to recognize all the people that helped all the moving parts and this fairly large data collection and analysis. I'm going to cover in my presentation the introduction of the study, the research approach, and some key findings and conclusions from the analysis and results. It was a large study, so I'll only be touching on the main original data collection that we completed, but if you have any other questions about this study, I'm happy to share any of the documents or files that we put together. I will provide my email at the end of this presentation. So the purpose of this study and the original motivation came from some of the mandates in California transitioning the evaluation of transportation impacts to include vehicle miles traveled. Part of the funds that are collected from some of the cap and trade efforts will go back into subsidized affordable housing. And because of this, they were concerned with gathering a better sense of what transportation impacts occur at these subsidized affordable housing units. So this study came about to gather information that had not been collected before at these subsidized units to help understand whether we are unduly burdening these developments in our conventional TIA practices. There are several parts to transportation impact assessment, and Tabitha will cover a lot of the innovations that happen throughout the TIA process in general. This study really focuses on the demand piece, which is the trip generation. It's the first part of the evaluation of these sites. The manual and the conventional practice that this line of study is really coming from are ITE's Trip Generation Handbook and Trip Generation Manual. These manuals have been, the handbook and the manual have been the seminal piece of trip generation analysis for decades. Only recently have they started incorporating person trips, multimodal trip estimation practices, and they've only recently started to remove some of their older data. So by and large, these types of methods are really due for a big update. And part of this study, our aim and focus was to pilot and test additional innovations in the data collection process to further improve trip generation estimation. And we're really building off of some recent studies that came out of California, the Smart Growth Trip Generation studies, Washington, D.C. DOT studies, as well as some of our older studies out of Portland State University. So overall, what our aim was in this 3-year study was to get a better sense of the assessment of transportation impacts going beyond the conventional vehicle trip generation to include things like person trip rates, to gather more information about the built environment, the structure including parking supply, and the impacts of differing urban contexts. Ultimate goal was to develop subsidized affordable housing rates that can be used instead of using the market rate trip generation estimates that have been used before. Before I get too in-depth into the details, I wanted to provide some definitions for those who are less familiar with trip generation in general. When I talk about the person trip generation rate or the motorized vehicle or just the vehicle trip generation rate, what I'm really talking about is the number of trips, either person trips or vehicle trips, entering and exiting the site during the peak hours. And so the AM peak hour we define as 7 to 10 a.m. The PM peak hour is defined as 4 to 7 p.m. And when I'm calculating these rates, we're taking them per unit of development. So we're looking at the number of trips that each dwelling unit is generating on average. And we're using ITE's defined way of estimating the trip rate. And all you need to know right now is that we're using ITE's definition of peak hour, but I'm going to come back to that at the end because that actually has some pretty large implications for what those average trip rates are. So I'll come back to that toward the end of the presentation. For our research approach, we really took a triangulated approach. We did our ITE compatible trip generation study analysis, but we wanted to supplement that with a household travel survey analysis and a mail-out survey. Because we're looking at dwelling units, we're looking at residential housing units, we wanted to test the application of a truncated mail-out survey to see if we can gather more information about transportation demand management strategies that households might be taking advantage of and so on. But for this presentation, I'm really going to focus on our original data collection and the on-site trip generation study. So for our on-site trip generation study, we collected vehicle and person trip counts entering and exiting the site for the AM and PM peak periods. We were able to collect 26 affordable sites throughout the San Francisco and LA regions. And we defined these affordable sites. We selected from those that are open to all, so not those that are catering to seniors, homeless populations, and those that are open to households that qualify for 30 to 60% of the average median income for that area. So we wanted to pick sites that were relatively similar in terms of the demographics, and we wanted to sample across the two regions in general. We also included an intercept survey where we could that allow us to estimate travel mode and group size, as well as some other things. And we have a little bit of that to talk about here today. This is 2 maps of our sites as they're spread throughout the region. We limited our sample collection in the suburban neighborhoods because ITE's data tend to represent very suburban neighborhoods. So we wanted to use as much of our budget for data collection in the urban areas where we just have less data. We also collected very few sites in downtown San Francisco, specifically because that's such a different context. And they actually have recently collected quite a bit of data in that area. Our household travel survey analysis, which I'm not going to talk about the results today, but if you're interested in that, this was a statewide analysis which looked at a variety of outcomes, not just the trip generation outcomes, and it has been published in an open source journal, JTLU, which anybody can access if you're interested. We did sample our mail-out survey. I bring this up specifically because it was something that we were very hopeful would be very useful for allowing us to estimate dwelling unit transportation impacts. But our sample was so skewed towards the 26 sites and not the larger site sample of 109 sites that we haven't used that in a formal analysis that I'm presenting today. But if you're interested in some of what we found, which include TDM related strategy use, I'm happy to also share that after this presentation. So for our analysis and results, I'm going to focus first on comparing with ITE, because ITE is the conventional use for this land use, I want to compare what we found specifically to ITE. So for those who are less familiar with ITE's trip generation rates, the graphic that you see on your screen right now is a representation that closely mimics how these rates are estimated. The x-axis, the bottom axis, the number of dwelling units is an indication of the development size, the number of dwelling units in each development. The y-axis is a representation of the average vehicle trip-ins for that site. So those are the vehicle trips coming and going for that site based on the number of dwelling units in that site. The graphic you're seeing here is the AM peak hour, so this is the morning 7 to 10 a.m. peak hour rates. The little X's you see are ITE's data based on the 9th edition when this graphic was made. They've recently released a 10th edition in which the 220 apartments have been reconfigured with the low-rise, mid-rise, high-rise, and so on, but the rates are relatively similar. I've also plotted Los Angeles's trip generation data. So they did a concurrent study of vehicle trip rates for sites specifically in LA. So I plotted those using triangles. The colored dots are our sites. So these are the actual ITE-defined vehicle trip rates for the dwelling units of our sites. One thing you'll notice is there is a pretty big outlier in a suburban neighborhood, a purple color. This site was very interesting because it was adjacent to a Starbucks, and we saw really high trip rates in general coming and going from the site, even though we were just looking at the residential development. Anecdotally, we think that that may have something to do with the AM peak hour being so important for people to get to work, much less flexible than the PM peak hour. In general, what we see is that the AM peak vehicle trip rates are generally lower than the average ITE trip rates, but not by a whole lot. So it kind of depends on which neighborhood you're looking in, but it's not severely overestimating those trip rates. When we look at the PM peak hour, though, we're seeing anywhere from 30 to 50% depending on the neighborhood that you're locating in. So if you're using the market rate ITE rates, you're going to be overestimating the vehicle trip in the PM peak hour for subsidized affordable developments. But I mentioned before we also collected person trip information. Now, person trip information is really important when we start to talk about multimodal trips. In the most recent edition of the ITE handbook, we've moved towards a person trip and mode share model for estimating multimodal trip generation rates. But there is very limited ITE supported data that collects its person trip rates. So what we're seeing here is the approximation of ITE person trips using their 3rd edition handbook approach compared with our observed sites. What you'll notice, fairly obviously, is that ITE's person trip approach tends to pretty severely underestimate the number of people coming and going from the site. This really starts to matter when you're looking at who those people are that you're underestimating, which are largely person trips and bike trips. I'll show the mode share rates in just a minute. Looking at the PM peak hour, we see much less spread. It's a lot closer. On average, it's still underestimating person trip rates, but overall, it wasn't as bad as we were thinking it might be, worried it might be. Looking at the mode share based on our intercept survey, we're seeing that almost half of the urban core people coming and going to our sites are taking transit, they're walking, or they're biking. Even as you move towards the urban districts and the urban neighborhoods, we're still seeing a really high percentage of mode share that is non-auto. And even when you look in the suburban neighborhood, we're seeing almost 22% of people coming and going by non-auto in the AM peak hour. In the PM peak hour, we see something fairly similar, a little bit more drastic in terms of reducing the auto trips. So if you think back to the person trips estimated in the AM peak and how underestimated the ITE approach adjustment was, Those trips that are being underestimated are largely coming by walking or transit and bike. So this means that when you're looking at signal timing, when you're looking at turning bays and so on, you might be fairly severely ignoring the number of people that are getting to the site, but not by car. Walking through a little bit of the multivariate analysis that we did, this is the results that were presented in the report. We have since done some additional analysis. We've added some new data and done some supplementary analysis. But what I'm presenting to you is what has been peer reviewed. So I'll talk a little bit about what we've learned from this and how it's changed as we've updated our analyses. The first thing that is really noticeable is that the distance to transit stations was not significant across the board. This is a really common variable for these types of analyses, but what's interesting about our sites is because they're subsidized, there's some location efficiency that is required for these sites. So the variation in how far these sites are from transit is very small, making it not significant. In recent iterations, we've adopted transit accessibility measures, and we're finding that transit accessibility, the number of jobs and opportunities accessible by transit to those sites, does become significant, specifically for the motorized vehicle trip estimation. One of our biggest findings was that the parking supply, the parking ratio, was not only significant, the effect size was relatively large, and it was one of the biggest predictors or the variable that captured the most variation here. Parking supply is not something that's brought into a trip generation estimation analysis currently, but this is an indication that it's something we should be considering in these analyses. The other two interesting things that are somewhat related is that we found the size of the dwelling units are both significant and capture quite a bit of variation. The size of the dwelling units is not something that is typically brought into these analyses, even though this makes sense. The larger the household, the larger the dwelling unit, the more people are likely to live in those dwelling units. So it makes sense to bring this into this analysis, and we got confirmation on this. The Bay Area dummy was interesting when we first found it because we were expecting Bay Area, especially the vehicle trip rates, to be significantly lower. What we've learned in subsequent analyses is that this Bay Area dummy might actually be capturing differences in the dwelling units compared to Los Angeles, which means that the size of the dwelling units are actually different in the Bay Area compared to Los Angeles. So we've updated this in recent analyses to include square footage, which we found to better represent the size of the dwelling unit without capturing this Bay Area Los Angeles difference in size in terms of bedrooms. So to summarize our key findings and takeaways, the two main correlates that are very important in this analysis are dwelling size and parking supply. This is relatively common sense, but it's not something that's typically captured in these analyses. But we've learned that it's very important that parking supply is correlated with reduced vehicle use. Another significant finding was that almost half of our trips, especially in the urban core district and neighborhood, are taken by walk, transit, and bike. So by only looking at vehicle trip, we're ignoring almost half of the people who are coming and going from the site, and we may not be planning site adjacent mitigations that accommodate that. In our larger study, we're sort of moving forward this collection of person trips, mode share data. We're re-solidifying this idea that thinking about vehicle trips alone is not very useful, and that in our conventional methods that are in the 3rd edition IT handbook, we are still underestimating person trips in general, and that burden is specifically placed on these walk, transit, and bike trips. We did find that we have a lower PM peak rate than ITE, so at these affordable sites, if you're using ITE's rates, you would be overestimating vehicle trip during the PM peak hour, which is the most common peak hour to use for analysis. We also want to caution that this finding linking parking supply and vehicle trip, we are looking at subsidized affordable housing. The makeup, the demographics, the people who are living in these households, by constraining parking, we may be placing additional burdens on them. So restrictions on unbundled parking or lowered parking supply for these units should be considered in consultation with people who understand the implications for housing. I wanted to point quickly to a few ongoing studies if this is of interest to you. UC Berkeley is doing a more detailed GPS analysis. The City of Portland is doing a number of innovative adoptions of new data specifically for their system development charge impacts. And we have another Caltrans project that's starting soon, operationalizing the link between parking supply and VMT for sites. The thing I wanted to leave you with is coming back to ITE's definition of peak hour. And when we talk about the average vehicle trip rates per peak hour, we often think that that's a true average. But what ITE defines as a peak hour is considering the maximum observed hour of vehicle trip rates during the 2 or 3 hour data collection. So that average peak hour rate is in fact an average of maximums. For the observed data that we have, the counts that we collected that I've discussed with you today, that maximum peak hour rate that is used is about 35% higher on average than what we would consider a true average. So I just want to leave that thought with you today because it is an embedded assumption in these analyses, and it's not something I believe that people really consider when they're applying different data. This is my contact information. I think we're taking questions at the end of the webinar, but feel free to email me with additional questions or requests for anything here.
Christina,
yeah.
John, we just had one real technical question I thought you can answer quickly.
Yes.
What was the, did you offer incentives for the mail-out survey, and what was the response rate? I think you might have had that, but someone asked.
Our response rate was just under 5%, and we did offer drawing for, I think, somewhere between $5 to $10, $25 gift certificates.
Great. Thank you. Perfect. Okay, so our next speaker will be Tabitha Combs.
Hey everybody, I'm here, John. I don't yet have screen control though.
Tabitha, I just sent you, or just made you host.
Okay. I can see my screen. Can you all?
Go to the bottom and you should see a green box with an arrow. There you go.
Okay. Awesome. So we're going to now leave the West Coast and zoom back east. I'm going to talk about what drives communities to consider and adopt new approaches to traffic impact assessment, focusing on the metropolitan Southeast and a little bit of Mid-Atlantic area. I want to thank my co-authors on this study, Noreen McDonald, the department chair at UNC's Department of City and Regional Planning, and also our fabulous graduate assistant, Will Lyman-Stahl. Many of you, I think in the webinar, have actually spoken to Will in the process of us completing this, this research, and so you know how indispensable he's been to this project. So we know and Christy just talked about this a good bit. We know that the conventional approach to TIA has some shortcomings, particularly for places that are really trying to move towards a more multimodal, walkable, or compact development patterns. And we also know that a lot of places, a lot of entities have been working to try and develop alternatives to that conventional model, including ITE itself. And what we don't know is whether or not those efforts are being taken up by cities, whether they're proving to be useful, if they're actually helping cities and counties change their practices to work towards more multimodal and livable development patterns. So our first objective really was to just describe the state of TIA practice, starting in southeastern mid-Atlantic metropolitan communities. We also wanted to know what's driving communities to change their approaches to TIA and what, if anything, is holding them back, whether it's keeping them from innovating or just something that they have to work around. And then finally, we were interested in figuring out what sorts of guidance the research community really ought to be working on that would actually be of use to communities that are trying to change and adapt their TIA practices to more modern travel patterns and preferences. So to start trying to find answers to these questions, Will, our research assistant, interviewed planners and engineers who were involved in the development review process in 36 cities and counties in North Carolina, Virginia, and Maryland. He also conducted really brief surveys in, I think, 27 other communities, places that weren't able to provide somebody to do an interview, but at least could do a brief survey. These interviews lasted between 30 and 45 minutes, during which time Will and the interviewees discussed the community's approach to TIA in pretty great detail, and then they went through a list of questions that were designed to elicit information about each of our research questions. We transcribed those interview recordings, some content analyzed them over the course of a few months last fall, and we pulled out information on the current practices with respect to TIA, as well as anything else that would help us identify the themes related to our research questions. Just a note about our sample, it was really quite diverse. We had some rural counties, some small towns, some pretty hip and happening tourist destinations, suburbs, and major cities. The one key characteristic of all of the places in the study was that they were experiencing population growth, for the most part growing faster than the median for their state. So places that are experiencing growth and some development pressures. And the other thing they had in common, which I really need to add, is that they had staff who were willing to sit down and talk with us about what their community's approach to TIA is and how they're changing, if they're changing at all. So those of you who are out there listening in on this webinar, thank you so much for your input. We couldn't have done it without that. So what did we find? Well, we found that TIA practices vary widely from several places that were following a pretty straight up conventional approach to conventional with minor tweaks to substantial overhauls to the TIA practice. One thing we didn't really find that I kind of expected to was either a wholesale abandonment or replacement of the TIA approach. Of the communities that were doing something, that were moving away from conventional TIA, we found a diverse range of new ideas and practices. And interestingly, we found that the farther away from the conventional model a community was, the wider the range of new practices they had adopted. Now that might seem a little self-evident, but we're going to come back to this idea later, and I think we'll find that there's something that we can learn from that. So just hang on, hang tight. Before, we've got to get through some really busy tables. If you look on the bottom of the slide, you can see the various ways that we identified communities were innovating with respect to TIA practices. Going through all of our interview transcripts, we actually found 57 unique practice changes that we sort of condensed down into these 8 category types, well, 7 category types, and then 1 miscellaneous group that we just couldn't categorize any further. The most common practice change we found were those that we called variances and waivers. And the idea with this was that certain projects, certain proposals under certain conditions could be exempt from part or all of the TIA process. This was the most common, and you can see it if you look at the chart up top, which lists the ID code for our communities, at least the ones that were doing something other than straight up conventional TIA. You can see that in just about every case, they had some sort of variance or waiver in place. We also found that most places were requiring developers to include some sort of provisions for non-car travel modes. Again, we're focusing on places that are trying to move towards a more multimodal approach to TIA. Most of these places that did have provisions for non-car modes, these were layered on top of the standard TIA. A couple places were trying to integrate it into the TIA, but for the most part, it was an add-on to the permitting process. As you go down the chart, I'm not going to read through them all, but you can look back if you can access the recording later. They sort of drop off in popularity as you go down. And then I think what I was saying before, where we said that places that were adopting a greater range, a greater variety, or sorry, a greater number of changes, were also adopting a greater variety. You can sort of see this reflected in the chart up top, where you see the places, the MD1, NC1, MD2 places that were really aggressive with their changes, adopting a lot of differences from the conventional approach, were really hitting just about all of the different kinds of types of change we found. And then you go to the far right, NC 7, 9, and 11, and you see that they're just getting one or two, and what they're getting is the popular stuff. It seems like maybe places that are more innovative and adventurous are really trying a wider range of things, and places that are just sort of testing the waters are really just testing kind of the tried and true, the things that seem to be working in other places. So what's driving this change? Why is it actually happening? We looked for 3 different change drivers following the literature on policy and practice change. So what we were looking for were pushers, pullers, and catalysts. So the push is the conventional TIA process, or specifically perceived shortcomings in the conventional TIA. So something that communities could move away from. The pull, it's aspirational. What does the community want to move towards, or what's it hoping to get out of changing their TIA practices? And finally, we need a catalyst, someone or something to be the spark and the driving force behind the effort to change. So starting with the push, the most commonly reported shortcoming of conventional TIA was that it doesn't guide good decision making. And we found this in 12 of our communities. And this was followed quite closely by ignores the wider system impacts. You look over to the right side of your screen and you can see sort of cascading down all the other shortcomings that we found that were voiced by at least 2 or more interviewees. So these are sort of in descending order of frequency. That they were biased in favor of development, that it undermined progressive and multimodal planning goals, which we thought was pretty interesting. Discounts impacts on or by other modes. There were a lot of different critiques and shortcomings offered up with respect to the conventional model in communities in our study. Going on to reasons for change, or the pull factor. The most common one was to improve accommodations for non-car modes, which we found again in 12 places, and followed quite closely by a desire to promote better development patterns. And you can read through those quotes later on. And then again, we've got the other reasons that were given in descending order of frequency. I thought the third one was pretty interesting. They just want to generate more useful information. The information they were getting from conventional TIA just wasn't really guiding development or helping them figure out how to shape development the way they wanted to. Catalysts for change, really quickly, this is the last ingredient we need in order to change practices. The most common catalysts we identified were staff and elected officials. We usually found these working in concert. Places that seem to have the most success in changing practices were driven both by staff and by elected officials. A few more human drivers of change, and then we also found some phenomena or particular events that instigated a movement to change. These always happen in concert with some sort of human. This was just sort of a spark that prompted the humans into action. The barriers to change were also really interesting. By far, the most common barrier or impediment to change we observed was a lack of guidance or technical assistance or tools. Really important for us from the research standpoint to get this feedback, because there's been tons of effort to develop guidance. And if it's not either getting to the communities that need it, or it's getting there and it's not proving useful, then obviously we're sort of spinning our wheels, not providing the help that we need to. Other common barriers kind of make sense. There's pushback from developers or perceived pushback. Elected officials might want, not always interested. State DOTs listed often as a barrier. Some things that sort of make sense. And then the last big piece of information we wanted was where they were getting their information. What's informing the change process? The top source of information here was neighboring or peer communities, followed by consultants, and then followed by professional development activities, continuing education, and literature, whether that was academic papers or reports or guidance from different agencies. So I want to go backwards a second just so we can start to understand what all of this means that I've sort of thrown at you so far. So we're going to go back to the drivers of change, ignoring the whole catalyst idea for a second. I want to talk about the pushers and the pullers. So collectively, we can think of these as motivations for change. And we cataloged all the motivations that each of our communities expressed, and then judged whether or not there were motivations that were related to improved multimodal or livability conditions, or if they were just something to ease the process along. We also cataloged the changes adopted in each place, and we also judged them based on, as they were applied in the community, whether they were likely to lead to more multimodal outcomes. Now, we couldn't judge actual outcomes because in a lot of places these changes have only just taken place, or the data don't exist to see whether or not they're working, or there's no counterfactual to compare them against. So we're just looking at whether or not it seemed likely they would be moving the community in a multimodal direction. The reason we did this was to try and identify typologies of communities with respect to how they were approaching and thinking about TIA innovation. What we found when we plotted that data, with the adopted changes on the horizontal axis and motivations for change on the vertical axis, we found a clear group of leaders. So these are places that were both highly motivated to change their TIA practices and also relatively successful in adopting changes. If you look down sort of on the bottom there, you'll see the group that's labeled following. These were communities that were adopting some changes, but not really expressing real certainty of motivation for doing so. And then we've got the top left corner, we've got the motivated group, places that were motivated, expressed a lot of motivation, sort of on par with what was happening in the leading group, but not gaining any traction in getting any of those motivations turned into actual changes. And then we've got the lagging group and the conventional group. Both of these groups are doing fairly straight up TIAs. The lagging group was expressing a little bit of desire to change, but nothing really, no major departures from the conventional approach. So this typology is really useful because it helps us in our effort as researchers to identify themes with respect to how and why communities evolve their practices, and how we can begin to better support change in different types of communities. So I just want to walk quickly through the themes that we found given those typologies. So first, with our leader communities, the primary shortcomings that we found in these places were that the conventional TIA model doesn't guide good decision making, and it undermines good planning, undermines their efforts to become more multimodal. Reasons for change were to support non-car modes and to ease development. A lot of these places is very dense cities that have rising costs of housing that are trying to make it easier to put in more housing in urban areas. The catalysts for change in these places were staff. across the board, interestingly, across the board, the public was not listed as a catalyst for change among the leaders. Sources of information were continuing education, literature, and consultants, but the key here is that these places sought diversity in the information that they went after. And barriers to change were public opposition and inertia, this idea that it's just, we're just so entrenched in what we're doing, having a hard time getting over the hump. Among the followers, the biggest shortcoming was that it's just too hard to do the TIA. It's just, there's a lot going on with it. Reasons for change in this group were to support non-car modes, but it wasn't a very strong association in this group. Catalysts for change, few of them were listed. Only 2 places actually had they could point to a specific person or thing that sparked and pushed the change effort. Primary source of information was continuing education. And they also listed very few barriers to change. Again, only 2 communities listed anything standing in the way, and that was only 1 in each place. And then our last group here is our motivated group. And they, the most common shortcoming there was that it doesn't guide good decisions, the conventional TIA. Reasons for change were to get better development patterns that aligned better with the community's goals and to have more transparency in the TIA process. Like the leading group, staff were one of the primary catalysts for change, but also in this case, the public was now a driver of change rather than a barrier to change. Sources of information were neighboring communities. So if you're one of those really, really progressive communities, make sure that your neighbors around you are, you're setting a good example for the neighbors around you. And then finally, barriers to change for this motivated group was a lack of guidance, a lack of tools to support their change efforts. Also, pushback from developers, the restrictions from the state DOT, and fear of congestion by members of the public and elected bodies. So how does this matter for planning, and especially for the research community in planning? So I think the first thing we found was that interaction with local planning staff really matters. The top change agents was staff, and so in a lot of places, the ability of your staff to push adoption of innovation is going to predict whether or not your community is able to innovate. Continuing education, things like this webinar, conferences were the top source of information, which is pretty heartening, I think, particularly for those of us who organized this. And the top criticism of conventional TIA was that it doesn't help provide the information needed to support progressive planning, and it doesn't move them towards their goals. And so interacting with local planning staff to figure out what information would help move them towards their goals would be really useful. Linked to that, evidence-based guidance and planning support tools matter. Places with more changes, like we said earlier, are adopting a lot more different sorts of changes. And one of the things that we saw that's not really reflected right here is that as communities were adopting more and more, becoming more and more different from the conventional model, they're also becoming more different from each other. And so what we didn't see a convergence on into some best practices. Instead, we saw divergence at the leading edge of our communities. And so that begs the question of whether or not communities are actually following there's a lack of a best practice, and so communities are just sort of having to wing it and make it up as they go, or maybe is the best practice being very context specific. And so that's an open question, that one that we want to push on a little bit and follow up. Another thing we found was that neighbors and networks are really important to change. A lot of the progressive cities, the places that were in our leading group, are surrounded by smaller places that are having less success gaining traction, and they're saying that their neighbors are their source of information and inspiration. And so keeping those pathways open between being the leading communities and their neighbors is very useful. Also continuing to run local conferences and local workshops. An interesting implication, I'm not sure that it helps the research community as much as it does the practice community, is the conflicting role of the public. And the leading communities, remember the public was listed as a barrier, and then the motivated communities that really wanted to change but weren't gaining traction, the public was listed as a driver. Now, there's a really cynical interpretation of that I'm not willing to take. I think the more optimistic interpretation is that the impetus to change, if you want it to be successful, needs to come from within. If you've waited for the public to notice there's something wrong with the process, then you've probably waited too long and are going to have a lot harder time making any movements in the right direction. The other thing that's interesting that I think is worth pushing is that the leading communities reported more barriers to change. If you recall, the following group had almost no barriers. They were adopting some changes, but they didn't have any aspirations, and they didn't report any barriers to change. The leaders, and less so the motivated group, were really quick to report barriers, to talk about all the different things that were standing in their way, and they talked about a variety of things, which begs the question of, is it just the effort, the awareness or the effort to change that makes you more aware of things that are standing in your way? It's more of a psychology of policy change question there, but I think it's interesting to think about how much harder it is to pull off change when you're really working at the leading edge. You've already done the low-hanging fruit, and now you're trying to get really, really innovative, and that's when you find, oh yeah, a lot of things really standing in my way. So that's all I've got. I'm happy to take questions again after we're done, but before that, I'm going to pass you off to one of the people who provided a lot of information for our study, Melissa McMahon of Arlington County, Virginia. She was one of our interviewees that we actually came back to a couple of times, just because the breadth of stuff that was happening in Arlington County and the experiences that they were able to talk about was fascinating, and I think that she's going to be able to provide a lot more interesting content. She's going to be able to illustrate a lot of what we found in our study. So I'll go ahead to Melissa now.
Thanks, Tab. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yes, we can hear you. Tab, can you stop sharing?
Yep.
Thank you.
All right. Let's see if I can make this work. Mm-hmm. All right. Are folks seeing the slide really big in your screen?
Yep, that looks great.
That's good for me.
Terrific. Thank you. Hi, yeah, thanks Tab and Christina and John. This has been really fun to listen to. And I hope I have a little bit of context to add as sort of a case study. My name's Melissa McMahon. I work for Arlington County, Virginia, and I'm just going to share with you a little bit of Arlington's transportation context and the way that we're approaching what we are calling our multimodal transportation assessment. So I would say, to start, I would classify ourselves as a fairly staff-driven process. We are heavily guided by guiding us. So when we're looking at how TIAs formerly and now our multimodal transportation assessment is giving us information to inform good future development, we, I would say, philosophically are not coming at it as how do we do a better job of mitigating negative impacts. We're actually flipping it around, and when we talk about our intentions, it's about how we can better meet the needs of the community, specifically how are our projects providing equity and access to all users? How are our projects and our transportation investments getting to the greatest good, getting to quality of life? How are we addressing the needs of residents and workers? And how are we considering, when we evaluate what's being provided by new development and what's being provided by the county, how are we capturing impacts on things such as the natural environment and health and fitness? One of the key ways that we do this is we do fairly heavy coordination of transportation and land use together. I'm not going to go through this whole model illustration, but essentially we have plans and models that happen at the regional level, which connect directly to our county master transportation plan and land use plan. Those are interacting. Those county-wide plans provide context for a very robust small area or sector planning process that we undertake. And with our sector plans, so you can think of them as station area plans, small area or neighborhood plans, we also very frequently undertake transportation specific assessments that couple with that plan to give it good context and to help lay out what the expectations are for that neighborhood to get us to the multimodal and transit-oriented place that we're looking for. And so our multimodal transportation assessment fits in this last little block, which is our special exception development approvals. We don't require these of by right development, but by and large, all of the major development projects going on in the county are happening through the special exception process because they're asking for more density or they're asking for more height or less parking, some exception to the rules, and that brings these projects before the board for approval and before staff for, I would say, a negotiation and public process on what that development should be doing. And a piece of that has historically been the submission of a TIA, and now what we're really trying to do is formalize what has been an evolving multimodal transportation assessment process. Some of the context of this is that Arlington continues to see a lot of population and employment growth. It's a 50-50 split, not in every neighborhood of the county, but countywide. And we have really for decades now been developing transit-oriented station areas that are really providing a lot of modal options for the people who live and work there. And at the same time, I would say prioritizing the preservation of more lower density single family neighborhoods as well. And that balance, while sometimes difficult to keep, is something that Arlington has achieved for a while. What we see when we pursue these land use and transportation balances is that we've got two, I would say, strikingly different mode characteristics across the county. This is the map of the county, and in orange are our Metro Rail and I would say bus transit corridors, and in blue are the more single-family detached neighborhoods and some other kinds of land uses that don't quite, that defy classification, let's say, things like Arlington National Cemetery and the airport and such. So what you see is that in the transit corridors, our commute mode split, our single occupant vehicle commute mode split is between 28 and 35%, whereas in the residential neighborhoods, it's flipped, and it's the 50 to 60 to 70% single occupant vehicle mode split. And what that has also, how that has played out is that when we were doing traffic impact analyses early on, we would lay in assumptions on a new piece of development that would say, we're expecting to see 70%, kind of like those blue single-family neighborhood areas on the previous slide. 70% will be traveling by single occupant vehicle, and the remaining 30 will be traveling in some other way. But when we look at these developments that had those analyses done for them when they were first designed and before they were built and how they're performing today, it's actually flipped. And what we get in those neighborhoods with that development build-out happening is 70% non-auto mode share and 31% auto mode share. This is an example for one particular neighborhood. Again, in a particular zip code of the county, this is the traffic trend that we'll see across that whole zip code, tracking back to 1980. And what you see is that up into, I guess it peaks around 2000. Since then, despite increases in population and jobs, the daily traffic volumes for 25 count locations in this particular Arlington County zip code have actually been coming down. And what we see today are traffic levels roughly from the mid 80s. And this has been, we attribute it to land use and transportation planning that goes together quite well and that prioritizes mixed use, transit-oriented development neighborhoods. But it also speaks to what are we asking development today to tell us about their impacts that they predict they're going to have on the community, and how do we continue to bring the community along in an approval process that has a community element and a decision maker element. So for instance, what should our multimodal transportation assessment assess if, as you can see on this slide, we're actually looking at a lot less vehicle traffic and a lot more folks taking other modes. So staff's approach is that, look, our former TIA process, the sort of the one on the book, so to speak, is ignoring 63 or more % of the trips that are the person trips that are happening out there. We can't proceed in a process where we're asking developers to produce evidence of the acceptability or the benefits of their project when they're only studying the trips caused by cars, when so many more trips that their development's going to generate are going to be traveling on public transportation, biking, walking, and doing other things. So staff looks at the process of scoping this as really one to ensure that all the modes of transportation we already see out there are truly accounted for and supported as part of our review in these special exception projects. We have sought a tiered approach that addresses, and Tab hit on this a bit, scaling our study requirements with project size and complexity. We recognize that there are more and less tangible barriers to new development. One of them is the burden that a community puts on a new development for the hoops it has to jump through before it can come to realization. And a complex study process for a relatively benign project is something that staff wants to avoid. We also want to establish guidelines for these studies that are consistent as possible from project to project, and that allow a study to provide results or reports, so to speak, in a manner that facilitates both staff and public review of its results. So not everyone who reads a TIA today or these multimodal transportation assessments that we are sort of improvising with new development today, not everyone is a transportation engineer or a planner who's reading them. And we really want to make sure that the final products we're getting are clear and legible, understandable for a wide variety of audiences. We also, and I'll put sort of as a small caveat, we have to consider compatibility with Virginia Department of Transportation requirements for assessments like this when projects are adjacent to VDOT managed roads. So some of the key features of our MMTA thus far, and I'll put out there, we don't have a final product yet to point people to. We're actually, staff are in the midst of this process, quite well along, working originally with a consultant support on this project, and now it's kind of folded into a more staff-driven finalization. So we're not done, but what we're seeing come out of this, one of the key elements is person trips rather than vehicle trips. We're starting out the assessment with that using ITE Trip Generation 10th edition. And staff, on the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about the challenges of how we select these approaches. Another key feature is our approach to mode split. Instead of asking each project to set and justify the mode split that it thinks its building is going to create, we're actually proposing to establish default estimates of mode split by neighborhood so that it's just mapped and an applicant knows based on where they fall in the community what mode split assumptions they should use. We are also working on setting the trip generation thresholds that would allow staff to say, right off the bat, is this project too small to warrant any analysis at all? It's just not necessary. Or is this project big enough that whether it's because of vehicle trips, because of transit trips, because of active transportation trips, it really warrants extra analysis or extra attention. And that leads to, our MMTA is not looking at just one mode, traditionally cars, but we're so far classifying it as 3. Active transportation, which is right now both pedestrian and bicycle transportation, and probably this would encompass things like scooters and e-bikes too, as we're seeing on the streets here today. A separate analysis for transit and a separate analysis for automobiles. Our MMTA is also geared at this point in time toward a largely qualitative assessment, particularly for active transportation and transit. And this is both because of the philosophical underpinnings. We're not looking to penalize I guess I'd say that the LOS A to F concept is one that is really looking at congestion as either pass-fail, it's good, like no congestion is good and lots of congestion is bad, but in an urban place like most of Arlington, that dichotomy doesn't really translate. It is not necessarily so black and white. And so we felt that a qualitative approach to some of these issues, in particular, really strong inventories and mapping of the state of infrastructure and services around a building, is going to be more useful to us to both plan county capital infrastructure planning and service planning, as well as what we would expect the developer to provide by way of their development project and the improvements that they can provide along the block faces that are a part of their project. And finally, another key feature is that the guidance document we're crafting needs to speak to multiple external audiences as best as possible. And the 2 that we're currently focusing on are the developer transportation consultants, so those that they hire to prepare their multimodal transportation analyses. So in that way, the guidance document has to be very clear and technically clear and accurate, and get to the brass tacks of what kinds of analyses have to be provided and what documents submitted. But at the same time, we want our guidance document to speak generally to community members about why we're taking a multimodal transportation assessment approach, how it's going to serve the community better than what we've done in the past, the overall purpose of these assessments, and the rationale behind the thresholds that we'll be setting that may dictate why some projects don't have to do an assessment at all. And lastly, I wanted to just highlight that, and I'm happy to take some questions at the end about some of these challenges, but the challenges that we are encountering along the way include what are assumptions going in about what kinds of models we could select or have developments use for generating their trip estimates. And we went through an early process of looking at several approaches, including MXD and regional and local studies, where we already collect some primary data, but we would, talking about to what extent development would need to do that. But we landed back on ITE version 10 and with a person trip generation approach. And selecting sources of assumptions for mode split, we looked at several sources of that, both and evaluated them on the quality of their data, both for production of trips and attraction of trips. And what we landed on was ultimately the regional household travel survey, but we looked at several other sources as well. And there's a bit of, pros and cons to every choice that you make. Reducing study burden versus improving the data set for staff, we continue to grapple with how much should we be asking for, how long should the inventory be, how much detail do we need to know about bus stops, and how far away from a given project should an applicant be required to study, and compare that to what we would expect in terms of mitigation from them. So this is a challenge we're still working through. And finally, I wanted to highlight again the challenge of writing for multiple different audiences. It's just as a research paper is different than a memo to the board, we are continuing to try to imagine what the final product needs to be as we work through the pieces of that product to ensure that it's tailored to the audiences that we need to speak to, and and is as useful as possible. And my last slide is just giving some credit to the existing active working group that we've got going on it with Arlington County staff today and the Kimley Horn folks who supported us at the initial phase of this process. That's it for me.
Great, thank you. Excellent presentation, all three of you. But really nice to see it grounded in a, within a municipality, a county. I know a lot of counties here in South Florida are struggling with these same issues. So I think Arlington County is really, a great example that I'm excited to share with folks that I know down here. We've had, there's a question on the chat window, and I'll start with that one. Feel free for others if you would like to, add your questions, or if you would like to, well, if you want to ask your questions out loud, maybe just indicate in the chat window and then I can call on you and then you can unmute yourself. But I think most of you could probably see, I'll just read it. It said, it was great to hear in the first presentation that the data and research shows a strong link between vehicle trip generation and availability of parking. At DDOT, that's the District of Columbia's DOT, we're about to launch their revised multimodal review guidelines, which they will call a Comprehensive Transportation Review. In this edition, they're looking to right-size vehicle parking rates by land use and distance to metro rail and transit as a way to ratchet down the supply of new parking coming online. Aaron Zimmerman, who's writing this, says he's interested to hear if any planning or transportation departments at other jurisdictions are doing this.
Hi, this is Christy Currens. I think that's fantastic, and I'm hoping that I'll get to see these new revisions as they come out. That's very exciting. The project I mentioned at the end of the presentation, sponsored by Caltrans, looking to operationalize the link between parking and VMT estimation at a site level. That project was really championed by a relatively sizable group of cities in California, local agencies in California, looking to bring parking into this process. I suspect that based on the current guidelines, SB 743 from the Office of the Governor, I suspect that what you're talking about at DDOT would be somewhat similar to some of the things that people in these California cities might be interested in adopting if they haven't already. So I'm very curious about what you're doing at DDOT.
Aaron, are you able to unmute yourself and chat? Yeah, it sounds like maybe someone's there. Okay, doesn't look like it's a problem. Okay, no problem. Any other questions from anybody else? Oh, no problem. He lost his connection. If you get your connection back, feel free to chime in. Are there any other questions? I don't see any other questions in the chat window. Anybody have a question?
Tom, this is Mara. Can I come in?
Okay, there is another question from Paul Castanano, sorry. Are the multimodal trip breakdowns for the 22202 zip code representative of the blue subdivision-oriented portion of your county, or more representative of the orange transit-oriented corridor?
Okay, so in terms of the slides, the slide that showed the traffic that was decreasing over the past 15 or so years within the 22202 zip code. That zip code is largely consistent with an orange transit-oriented corridor. It is not 100% that. It consists of the Pentagon City, Crystal City area of Arlington County and some of the neighborhoods that are immediately adjacent to that. But the quick answer is yes, it's more consistent with orange than with the blue in terms of the countywide map.
Great. Any other questions? Okay. We have a committee website, and this presentation is going to be made available as a video recording on that website. And if you give me a second, I will post that web link here in this box. Sorry, it's just taking a second. And if you have any more questions, okay. Oops. All right, I gotta post that to everybody. Okay, so that is the web link directly to the where the video will be posted. Some asked for posting the slides. I actually don't have the slides because people took remote control. So if the presenters want to send me their slides in PDF, I'd be also happy to post it on that website, but I don't have it right now. Okay, we do have a question from Patricia Tice asking that she would like to know about encouraging complementary land use. Patricia, I'm not sure what you mean. Can you expand on your question? Feel free to unmute yourself and talk if you'd like, or feel free to type in your question.
Yeah, the question has to do with one of the biggest things that needs to get done is breaking up these large zones, large single-use zones. Is there any thought in your analysis process about them showing you how their land use actually complements the land use around it, or the land use, or encouraging people with any kind of incentives to put in complementary land use?
Hi, this is Christy again. From a trip generation demand perspective, we've seen that specifically for residential uses, when residential uses are in areas where there's a greater retail employment density, a greater level of opportunity and accessibilities to complementary retail uses, we tend to see much higher person trip generation rates, which implies to some degree that people are taking advantage of those opportunities when they exist. Similar related findings on other retail uses when we look at how people are getting there for different retail uses. But that's a great question, and it's one that I've been really interested in digging back into some of the existing data we've collected across the country to look at how mixed use can support lowered vehicle use, as well as an increase in overall person trip behavior by alternative modes. Great question.
Patricia, this is Tab. That's something that did not come up explicitly in any of our interviews, although I think implicitly it may be in a couple of the new approaches that we found, where waivers or variances to the TIA process could be granted in particular situations And some of those situations were quite specific, where there were areas of town that were delineated as just, anything goes, development happens here by right, or certain forms of development could happen without having to go through a TIA. And then there were a few places where it was just left really open to discretion, that the sort of the tenor of the conversation led us to believe that maybe that discretion included what was happening in the adjacent land area, but nothing explicit, where there was no explicit mention of making sure that developments mesh with surrounding land uses.
Yeah, it seems like we might have a fighting chance at getting more mode shift if we can get those complementary land uses in closer proximity, especially now that you're beginning to see scooter share.
Patricia, this is Melissa. I just wanted to also add that fundamentally the land use opportunity that a developer sees in a given site in Arlington has a lot to do with what the general land use plan and the sector plans portray. And so I would argue that a strong land use and transportation planning foundation that's really community-based, that has had robust outreach and buy-in from those neighborhoods, sets up a developer to have a really good sense of what combination of things he, she, they can put on their site. And they're typically looking for, they're gonna come up with a proposal that they think they can make money off of, that they think is sustainable if they're gonna own that property for a long time, or that they can sell for a lot of money if they're gonna flip it. But ultimately, that makeup has a lot to do with what's already around it, and with how it jives with the vision that the neighborhood has and how it's helping to fulfill that vision. And I think that the plans in Arlington do a pretty good job of laying that out, so that when a developer actually gets to staff, they're showing something that, even if it needs ironing out, is really trying to fulfill that vision.
So we have another question here asking if folks know if any state DOTs are promoting or requiring multimodal traffic impact assessments. Anyone want to take that question?
Hi, this is Tab. North Carolina is explicitly not in that group. I know Virginia is, Melissa can probably speak to this a little bit better, but Virginia is working on an alternative that municipalities and counties can use that has more of a multimodal focus. And Maryland, I don't quite remember what the state level practices were in Maryland. Those are the only states that we've looked at so far.
Anybody in the listening audience know? Okay. Any other questions? Any other final questions? I actually have one for you, Christy. You looked at affordable housing, and I was curious about how you looked at the built environment. I mean, I noticed that you looked at affordable housing in urban areas more so than suburban areas, but did you do a more detailed analysis of the built environment, and how do you think the affordable housing trip generation compares to non-affordable housing, just market rate housing?
Yeah, so two questions there. We were bringing in some of the built environment metrics. I didn't explicitly discuss them because I've uncovered in some of the additional analysis that Some of the significance we're seeing is driven in part by just a handful of sites, but it is consistent with what we would expect, where an increase in employment density or just activity density in general would correlate with reduced vehicle mode shares, vehicle trip rates. Population density wasn't significant, which is not at all a surprise to me, but in later iterations we did start to see, as I mentioned I think a little earlier in the questions, that an increase in retail employment density was correlated with an increase in person trip rates, implying that people are coming and going from their house in the morning and the evening more frequently than in areas with low retail densities in and around the site. Transit accessibility, which is something we incorporated more recently, was also significantly related to auto trips. It was positively correlated, which implies that an increase in transit accessibility was related to a small increase in vehicle trips. What we think is happening there is that it's a proxy for regional accessibility as well. But overall, what we're seeing is that person trip rates across the built environment for these residential units tend to be relatively stable. As we compared with ITE's data are representative of market rate. So what we did find in terms of PM peak vehicle trip rates definitely being lower than ITE is a combination of both ITE's suburban nature as well as the fact that it's market rate. We did some additional comparison that I didn't talk about here with some of the smart growth trip generation apartments data that were collected in the same study areas. What we saw was that smart growth areas, market rate development, tend to have lower vehicle trip rates than the affordable housing developments that we observed. Our affordable housing developments were about 2/3 smart growth locations based on the definitions of the prior smart growth studies. So although these observed data appear lower than general suburban, not smart growth trip rates, when we're getting into the urban areas, the affordable housing developments aren't necessarily lower in vehicle trip rates. What we think is happening based on analysis of American Housing Survey is that subsidized affordable development dwelling units tend to be smaller than market rate, and they tend to have more people per dwelling unit in them, so they have larger household sizes. And we believe that this is partly why, in similar smart growth areas, why market rate might have lowered parking rates, or sorry, lowered vehicle trip rates.
Great. And I have another question, and then if others have questions, feel free to post them or ask. Another question that I had is, several of you mentioned the ITE 10th edition of the Trip Generation Handbook and focusing on person trip rates. Is that, can some of you maybe provide some information about that? Has that much more in line with mixed-use development, trip generation rates? It seems like Arlington County is using that. Is that something you would encourage other municipalities to look at?
Yeah, I participated in the 3rd edition of the handbook, which moved the methods pointing towards person trip rates. The 10th edition is then incorporating the available data, which for person trips and multimodal data, that's largely the sort of recent studies you've seen. It's studies like this, the smart growth, the DDOT's efforts, Portland State's efforts, aggregated. It's definitely a step in the right direction, but as I mentioned when we're looking at the person trip rate estimation, for most land uses, they're not considering that there is no person trip generation data, and that adjusted person trip rate appears to not always be very accurate. So the more data we can collect, the more that can inform. And the last thing I would say is I do know that they've added a multifamily residential rate with bottom floor retail, which I believe is representative of the DDOT data that was collected as well as some other studies. So that is now available.
Great. All right. Well, are there any other questions? All right. Appearing that there are no other questions, we have come to the end of the webinar. Just 1 second though, before everyone leaves, I do want to share with you, I have information. Oops, I gotta find it now. 1 second. Sorry, I'm trying to find. Okay, can you all see information on this upcoming webinar on my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So we are going to have an upcoming webinar on Tuesday, May 21st. The time has not been set yet, but we will be letting you know that soon. It's called Accessibility Shift. Jonathan Levine and Joe Grangs from the University of Michigan and Louis Merlin from my institution, Florida Atlantic University, will be presenting. And so the theme of this is that despite a growing awareness of the centrality of accessibility among transportation and land use planners, the analytical techniques of the field, including traffic impact analysis, level of service modeling, and transportation equity analysis remain largely entrenched in mobility thinking. Such mobility-based transportation analysis tools can lead to anomalies in planning and evaluation. Planning for faster speeds do not always ensure and may even degrade people's ability to reach destinations. Since it's the destinations that matter the most for travel, transportation planners need decision-making tools that put accessibility front and center. So therefore, the webinar will develop an idea of an accessibility shift in transportation planning and the transportation aspects of land use planning. It will define 3 candidates for transportation planning's core logic: mobility, VMT reduction, and accessibility, and argue that accessibility is the basis that is best aligned with the purpose of transportation. Since implementing the shift to accessibility rests on developing appropriate decision-making tools, the webinar will demonstrate the use of accessibility-based approaches to evaluation and land development proposals in equity and equity in transportation. So this very much builds upon this webinar. So please, mark that on your calendars. We'll be sending out invites for that pretty soon. And with that, I want to thank you all. Again, don't forget to go ahead and get your AICP credits if you are AICP. And a version of this webinar will be posted, the recording of this webinar will be posted on this webpage, which is transportationandlanddevelopment.wordpress.com/webinars. Again, my name is John Rennie. I'm the chair of the Committee on Transportation and Land Development for TRB. I want to thank all the speakers. I want to thank Gary from TRB and Bill Anderson, who couldn't join us today, and Noreen McDonald, who also couldn't join us today, but was also instrumental for putting all of this together. So thanks you all very much, and have a great weekend, and hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, everybody.